Okay. So number two, ready availability of the raw material. Now, ready availability is very important. Raw material not only have to be cost efficient, but it should be readily available throughout the year. And this is very important. For example, it should not have a seasonal availability. And you know, some of the raw materials, they are available seasonally rather than their availability throughout the year. So there should not be the seasonal availability of the raw materials, rather they should be available throughout the year. And we should avoid the imported raw materials, because you know there are many restrictions. There may be certain problems in terms of the import of the raw materials. So raw materials should not be seasonal, and preferably they should not be the imported ones. If they are the seasonal raw materials or the imported raw materials, what would ultimately happen, that we have to store those raw materials throughout the year. We have to go for the storage of the raw materials. So if we are going for the storage of the raw materials, then you know, we have to select, we have to construct so many warehouses, we have to construct the uh, depots in order to store the raw materials for the use throughout the year. Then our cost of the final product would ultimately increase, right? Whatever we are consuming in terms of money in the industry, it would ultimately be translated into the final, into the ultimately be translated into the cost of the final product. So if we are selecting the seasonal raw materials, or those raw materials that we have to import, the ones, then we have to go for the storage of the raw materials to make the availability of those raw materials throughout the year. Then it means that we our price of the final product would go much higher. And not only we have to spend money on the storage of the raw materials, but also this is a chance that the stored raw materials could be attacked by the microorganisms. So many microorganisms, or the rodents or the insects, they come and they can spoil the raw material. So this is also another advantage. So we have to select, conclusively, I can say that we have to select those raw materials that are readily available instead of the seasonal availability or the import of the raw materials. Then at number three, transportation costs. Sorry, this is misspelled. It's costs. So transportation costs. This is also very important factor in selecting the raw materials for large scale industrial fermentations. So, for example, if the site of the production of the raw material is far away from the industry, is far away from the uh, from the from the site of the production of the product, then what would happen, that we have to not only bear the cost of the raw material, but also we have to bear the cost of the transportation to make the availability of that raw material exactly to the industrial site. So our again our cost of the final product would be increased. So it means that we have to go for selecting those raw materials whose site of production is in the proximity of the raw material of the user industry, right? Number one. Number two, yes, this would ultimately influence the cost of production. And if the cost of production goes up, then ultimately the market competitive competitiveness of the raw material would be ultimately affected. So um, conclusively, we need to go for those raw materials that are whose site of production is very near to the industry. So then in the criteria of selecting the raw materials, another point of discussion is the disposal of the waste. So ultimately, you know that every industry has a waste. Every industry, after the production of the final product, they would ultimately produce some waste. And either they have to treat that waste so that the waste could be discharged into the environment without any fear, or they have to directly dispose of that waste into the environment. So whatever the industry is going to do, uh, they have to care about the disposal of the waste while selecting the raw materials. This is another very important factor. So industry need to select, or the industrialists or the industrial microbiologists need to select those raw materials that whose disposal problems are very less. So if the waste is produced, their treatment cost is, for example, their treatment cost of their treatment should be very low, so that that would not be ultimately affected into the final product. And then if they are directly disposing the waste to the environment, their disposal should be easy. Their disposal site should be near, or their disposal should not affect negatively to the environment, or there should be alternative uses of the waste. So there are many waste that might find their alternative uses as well. For example, if you are in breweries, what happens that after the grain spent, what grain spent after the production of the beer or the alcohol, so this grain spent is a very good animal feed. So this is an alternative use. So many of the wastes have their alternative uses as well. So if if industry should select those raw materials that whose waste should find the alternative uses as well. Then at number 5 in the selection criteria of the raw materials for large scale fermentations is the uniformity in quality. This is very, very important. Uniformity in the raw material should be uniform in quality. So this means that the quality of a raw material would ultimately be translated into the quality of the product, quality of the final product, right? So if a batch of a raw material is of good quality, and the second batch is of low quality, and the third batch is of medium quality, then it means that our final product would be different in qualities. So when it reaches to the market, it would not ultimately satisfy the consumer requirements or the consumer's satisfaction that would be very necessary for the industry. So it means that our raw material should be uniform in quality. It's first batch of raw material, the second batch of raw material, or the third batch of raw material, the fourth batch of raw material, and so on. So every batch of a raw material should be tested for its quality. So it should have a uniform quality to be incorporated into the fermentation of the products. So for that purpose, we need to check, we need to regularly check the quality of the raw materials in use, and their uniformity should be ensured before their use. For example, if any industry, if there is a brewery industry and it is using barley malt for alcohol production or the beer production, and beer production, alcohol production is a huge industry worldwide. So if they are selecting the barley malt as their feedstock, so they should ensure that they are purchasing the barley malt uh, from the same market, or from same provider, in order to ensure the uniformity of the barley malt. And in the second step, they should also regularly check the quality of the barley malt by its testing its uh, chemical by checking its chemical composition. So um, in another example, molasses, and molasses are the uh, byproducts of the sugar industry. And sugar industry, after the production of the sugar, they consider these molasses as byproduct or as waste maybe. So similarly, the quality of molasses may vary from batch to batch. One batch of the molasses may have a different quality, and the second batch might have a different quality. So for the production of alcohol from the molasses, if you're going to produce alcohol from molasses, it is very necessary to check the quality of molasses before the production, so that the quality of the final product should not be changed. And ultimately, when it goes to the market, the satisfaction of the customer should be maintained on the on part of the manufacturer. Then at number 6, in the selection criteria of raw materials for large scale fermentations, there is adequate chemical composition. So raw material should have adequate chemical composition. Adequate chemical composition means it should have all nutritional requirements for the growth of the microorganisms. And we have already have a lecture on nutritional requirements of the microorganisms. So uh, you know that microorganisms, they need carbon. They need a carbon source in the raw material. They need a nitrogen source in the raw material. Then they need different minerals for their growth in the raw materials. Then vitamins or the growth factors. So if a raw material fulfills these nutritional requirements of the industrial fermentation, then it is said to be a good raw material. So while selecting the raw materials for large scale industrial fermentations, it is very necessary that its chemical composition should be adequate. Uh, it should not, it should have all the chemical constituents that are needed for the growth of the microorganisms. And uh, so this is very important factor while you are selecting the raw material. And for that purpose, again, the chemical testing of the raw materials is very necessary. Before the use in large scale fermentations, the raw materials should be checked, or its chemical composition should be checked before using into the fermenters. Then at 7th point, while selecting the raw materials, or in the criteria of the choice of the raw materials, another point is very important, and that is the presence of specific precursors. So what are the precursors? Precursors are the chemicals from which another chemical is produced, right? There are many chemicals that are produced from the previous chemicals. So when a chemical is produced from another chemical, that chemical is a precursor of another chemical, right? So this is a precursor. So while large scale industrial fermentations are going on, some microorganisms or some byproducts are produced by using certain precursors. So until or unless these precursors are not used in large scale industrial fermentations, the final product, the finished product, will not be produced. So it means that in addition to using the good quality raw material in terms of its chemical composition that fulfills all the requirements, all the nutritional requirements of the microorganisms, we have to also uh, we have to be very careful about the use of precursors in order to produce certain bioproducts in industrial fermentations. For example, if you are going to produce uh, penicillin G, so in industrial fermentations, to produce penicillin G, phenyl compound is very important. So phenyl compound acts as a precursor. So we use phenyl compounds for the production of penicillin G in fermentations. Another example is the use of cobalt for the synthesis of vitamin B12. So these are the two examples. Until or unless we do not use these precursors, the final products would not be efficiently produced. So it means that while selecting the raw materials, in addition to be very careful about the nutritional requirements, we also have to be very careful about the use uh, of precursors in the raw materials. So, students, thank you so much for listening me. And this is all about the raw materials, feedstocks, their importance in industrial fermentations, and the selection criteria. Why we choose raw materials, why we use raw materials in the industrial fermentations, and what criteria we adopt to select the raw materials for large-scale industrial fermentations. Thank you. And now, if you have any question, you can